So, welcome everybody to episode 4 of the Alcon Maddox COVID-19 War Plan webinar series. As you can see today, as you can see today, I'm Richard as normal, but I'm joined today by Hester-Wyne, who is one of the most respected crisis communication experts in the region. Eve often works with multinational blue chip organizations as well as government entities, advising on messaging, but then also delivering media training, which is pretty important in the current situation. Say hello, Eve.
Well, hello everybody. I'm delighted to be here.
Excellent. So just a bit of housekeeping before we get started. We've already done a sound check, so I'm glad that you can all hear us, but I tend to speak a little fast sometimes, guys. So if I am speaking fast and you can't pick anything up, please do just put a comment in the chat box and I'll restate it for you, okay? You'll have opportunities to ask questions throughout. This isn't a wait till the end and ask questions webinar. As we go through each of the points, just feel free to add a comment to the chat box or other question. If you have an insight, something you've just learned or something you find interesting, just type a capital I and then write the statement, and I'll read that out for you as well, just to make sure that the delivery of the content is on point for you guys, okay? So just a bit of background really about me for those who I haven't met already. As I said, my name is Richard. I run a company in Dubai called Alcon Maddox. We are an executive search and recruitment business. And we're a very niche organization. We just focus on the technology sector, the IT channel business specifically. Our primary focus, if you like, is sourcing senior talent for the tech sector. So typical roles would be channel manager, head of channel, director of sales, general manager, for example. But that said, today's not about me, nor is it about my business. It's actually about you. And I'm specifically now talking to senior business managers within the IT and services community. Now, over the past few weeks, I've been speaking to many of you who are on the call today. I'm really just trying to get a feel for, how are things in the market? How are things playing out for you guys? And a number of top of mind challenges have been articulated to me. And the idea being this webinar series has been put together to address each of those challenges for you. And then each week bring on an industry expert who can share with you some insights and guidance to help you deal with those challenges. So for me, this webinar series is more about giving back to the community, but then also bringing the IT community together so we can all thrive rather than just survive this crisis. So for those of you who participated already, you know that we've had sessions on managing a remote team, on cybersecurity, or the increased threat to cybersecurity, and also fast-tracking digital transformation. In the coming weeks, we're going to be discussing how to manage your partner ecosystem during the crisis, and also change management and business continuity as well. But this week, as I said, Eve Hester-Wyne is with us. We're going to be talking today about crisis management, crisis communication management, but specifically related to how are we safeguarding our reputation now in light of the post-COVID-19 world. Because the reality is the tough decisions we're having to make today around employees, around clients, around non-paying clients or investors to some extent, all these decisions and the way we communicate these decisions will have a lasting impact on our businesses. So without further ado, I will hand you over to Eve, who's going to give a little bit of information about herself, her background, and then we're going to get into the session. But you can expect to leave the session today with 3, if you like, ring-fence strategies on how to deal with challenges with those 3 types of entities, if you like, the clients, the employees, and the non-paying investors or clients. So, Eve, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Richard, for that very flattering introduction, and also for organising all of these very useful webinars. I think it's very important at this point to start thinking about the future. My background, I am a journalist and TV director by trade. I trained with BBC World Service. I worked for many years in the media, both as a journalist and a TV director, producer. And now my job is about communications. It's about helping brands to communicate themselves, and especially part of my training, I did some additional training in crisis communication. I have a specialised diploma in crisis communication management from the CIPR in London. And it has been one of the more interesting aspects of the way my working life has developed, has been getting into a position where you can actually help people to negotiate themselves through a crisis. And you could not pick a better example, or perhaps a worse example, than the times that we find ourselves in now. Of course, they are...
I would imagine your phone is ringing off the hook at the moment.
There is a lot going on at the moment. We are quite busy. It is funny when I hear about people saying box sets and time to catch up on all those box sets that you never watched. I think I've managed to watch 2 episodes of Spooks, which is one of the crime series that I watch. I decided, oh, maybe I'll get a chance to work my way through the whole series from the beginning. No, 2 episodes is all I've managed. Because yes, these are unprecedented times. These are times where companies need to reach out to, we'll say, the specialists, to the people who can help with messaging, to the people who can help with the whole theory behind crisis communications, and then the practice in terms of media training. And that's what I'm here to talk about today. In terms of, in general, a few general points before we get into the specifics. Richard and I have identified, we'll say, 3 particular sets of stakeholders that you might be interested in learning how to communicate with in a crisis a little bit more succinctly. But before I get into that, I'm just going to give you a general introduction into how we look at things from the crisis communications and the crisis management perspective. Yes, it's an unprecedented situation, but we are in it now, and companies and entities and countries have faced crises before. I think an important thing to realize is that we are preparing for the post-COVID-19 world, and that world is coming soon enough. I know the days seem long when people are stuck at home, but really the days are moving towards hopefully a vaccine, hopefully a time where this crisis will have passed. And we're talking probably maximum of 2 years. That is not a huge length of time in terms of reputation management.
I would just say it was quite interesting. So a few days ago when the UAE government chose to relax the lockdown restrictions here, I couldn't help but feel, in all honesty, I felt a bit anxious because I thought I haven't done enough during this period to get going, to explore different parts of business, what have you. And I think it's a really important point you make. We're in a period now of kind of crisis or uncertainty. That will go at some point. When it goes, is the uncertainty, if you like, the time period. But what we want to make sure is we're not caught flat-footed when that time arrives. So we really want to get our businesses in a position where we can really stand to benefit. But then also, in addition to benefit, we don't do anything now that shoots us in the foot, so we can't move fast. I
would say it's a tarnish or polish opportunity. There are things that you can do right now that will polish your reputation, that will let you and your company emerge from this scenario looking better than ever. There are things that you can do, or crucially neglect to do, that will tarnish your reputation. Now, just when you were saying that about, I suppose, all of the ambitions that we have under lockdown and things like that, I do think it's also important not to put a huge amount of pressure on ourselves and our employees. We need to be realistic. We need to know what we can and can't expect from people working from home, people working with restrictions, etc. What I'm saying today is not that, everybody needs to go out and learn 15 new skills and change the world from their bedroom. But I think what we're saying here is, well, in a realistic way, there are going to be things that happen during this lockdown period, during this period of social distancing, that can have an effect on your company. And it's wise to have a look at those. So I suppose we'll have a look at the more specific examples of the stakeholders in just a minute, but a couple of broad brushstroke top line things. When a crisis hits, which we're in now, the first thing we say is don't panic. Try at least to keep a clear head. I know it's difficult. Do whatever you can to keep a clear head, because one of your most important assets in the business world is your business reputation. Businesses rise and fall on their reputations amongst their various stakeholders, whether those stakeholders be clients, whether they be investors, whether they be employees. Your reputation is one of your greatest assets, and now is the time to protect it, to safeguard it, to make sure that you and your company emerge from this polished, not tarnished. So when the crisis begins, don't panic, keep calm, try to evaluate a plan, get the people on your team who you respect around you, formulate a plan, decide what outcomes you want at the end of this. And if that is, even if that is something as simple as that we will emerge from this with our reputation intact, well, that's a good objective to have as well. I mean, I know there are commercial objectives as well, and they will be specific to all sorts of different companies. Now, in terms of the next thing I'm going to say is, once you have a plan and once you have decided what you want to do, then you need to get your messaging organized. You need to understand what it is you want to communicate, and then you want to start to communicate it effectively. In order to do that, you need simple, clear messaging that cuts through the noise. There's a lot of noise at the moment. People are being bombarded on all sides by all sorts of information. If you want to get your message across, it needs to be quite succinct and quite simple. I don't know about you, Richard, but I was just joking yesterday that I have fallen into the trap of being absolutely addicted to scrolling. I lie in bed at night and I just scroll, and I think to myself, I shouldn't be doing this. There's too much information here. None of it is doing me any good. It's like eating junk food, but I'm still overloaded. And if I'm overloaded as somebody who's actually quite conscious of what it means to be overloaded and the pitfalls of being overloaded, well, everybody else is too. So from the point of view of you as a communicator, trying to communicate your company's messaging, remember that there's a lot of noise out there. You're trying to cut through the noise. How do you get your message across simply and succinctly? Even if it's an internal message to your employees or a confidential message to your investors, try to keep it as simple as you possibly can. Now the next thing,
wonderfully simple in itself, though, doesn't it? This advice, keep it simple. We hear the KISS principle, I guess, throughout many different facets of business. But why is it do you think that we forget that in a time of crisis?
Because we're being overloaded by information, and it's very, very difficult to think clearly. Even as individuals, we find it difficult to think clearly, to evolve clear, simple, straightforward messaging that expresses exactly what we want to say and what we want the audience to understand. Now, I would also say, before you get some messaging out, before you start to communicate, identify who your stakeholders are. Who are you trying to reach with your messaging? Are you speaking to a group of employees? Are you speaking to your customers? Are you speaking to, we'll say, investors? All of those are different. Are you speaking to the general public? Are you on your social media channels, we'll say, broadcasting to the international Twitterati, which is probably the scariest place in the world to broadcast to. So identify where you're going to be speaking, who you're speaking to, what you're saying, and then it's a question of how you say it. I'm not going to go too much into the detail of media training here because that's for a whole other webinar. But what I would say is, I have seen in recent weeks, and I think many of us, as we go through this webinar today, many of us will think of different examples of companies who have touched us as consumers in our own lives. I remember about 1 week after the total shutdown, I kept getting messages from various companies based here in the UAE, and they were all a message from the CEO. I counted 3 of them that were actual typed letters. There were PDFs of typed letters which were inserted into an email with the CEO's signature at the bottom. Yeah. And I thought to myself, what a missed opportunity. Why didn't they get the CEO on camera, speaking to camera, speaking like I'm speaking now, delivering a message that was even more simple than that letter? Who has the time to read a 4-page letter these days? Think about how you're going to communicate your messages. And for example, if you have staff who are all at home, think about the merits of perhaps recording a message for them where you express what you're going to say clearly. Think about how much more meaningful that is to have a CEO or a C-suite person or a leader actually speaking in person to stakeholders rather than a typed letter. I really do. I feel quite strongly about the whole typed letter scenario, that it is so old-fashioned and so inadequate to deal with people who are isolated, whether they be employers or clients or customers. They need faces. They need friendly faces talking to them.
Interesting one, because the idea of a type, or certainly a written letter, implies a personal touch historically, because you've taken the time to do it. But when it's sent digitally, you're taking that time element out of it, so it loses its effect, I guess, doesn't it?
Yeah, exactly. And
there's no proof they've even written it themselves.
Yeah.
Whereas, like you say, a video is clearly evident because they're there.
Exactly. What I would say is, for every company, have at least one, if not two, spokespeople ready to go for any sort of crisis. Get them media trained when they have some time. Make sure that they know all about the techniques of how to communicate. Make sure they've got accurate messaging to get through. And you'll be able to reach people in a much more immediate fashion with a friendly face speaking on camera. That's it. The third thing that I'll say before we start going into specifics is fix your marketing. I know people will have probably done that by now, but I think everybody can think of... I think,
look, let's not assume that people have fixed their marketing. I think the reality is, the reason why sessions like this are proving valuable to people is that they may have started a new marketing campaign, let's say, for example, but perhaps it's been misguided because it's been based on their own experiences, their own agenda, their own thinking of what is required. But in actual fact, the advice that you can give may enlighten a few people and make them rethink their communication strategy.
Well, I shall plough on regardless, even if they don't want it. What I would say, I think everybody has an example of, we'll say, an email or even a WhatsApp or some sort of a flyer that dropped in the first week of the very nervy isolation lockdown, which somebody had forgotten to turn off. For example, my family and I were supposed to be on a cruise the first week of May. That is not going to happen. We had received notification from the cruise company that our cruise was cancelled and we were going absolutely nowhere. And yet, into my inbox kept dropping reminders that we were going on a cruise and we were going to have a wonderful time, and didn't we see ourselves sunning it up in the Mediterranean? And I just thought to myself, really, somebody needed to turn off those marketing emails, because they're not really helping at the moment. Now, that's a very benign example. We've got examples, I mean, much more serious examples of, where companies who were in crisis, where very bad things had happened, train accidents, plane accidents, and yet the marketing continued with the companies that, encouraging people to travel, etc., etc. There are a few examples of that. I'm not going to go into great detail about them, but you can see how, for example, in a situation of crisis, there are going to be emails that are going to be inappropriate, and certain amounts of pre-calculated marketing is not going to work anymore. Often it can be quite difficult to find the guy who can turn that off. So if you ever want to plan for crises in the future, figure out who's the guy that can press stop on your automated marketing emails and your automated text messages. A good example was somebody was complaining on Twitter recently about the fact that she was continually getting messages from a salon saying, come and get beautiful hair, when everybody in Dubai knew that there was no salon because the salons had all been shut down. So yeah, I mean, you can see where that is going to make sense. So it's quite important to deal with, we'll say, the proactive marketing. Then you also need to think about, I suppose, how you're going to really market yourself. It's a tricky one, Richard, and in our conversation yesterday, when we were preparing for this, we did talk about this, because businesses, let's face it, they have to get through this. They have to keep doing business. But how do you manage to continue to approach clients and to continue to do things without seeming to be insensitive, without seeming to be taking advantage of a situation? Only you can really understand that, because you know your particular part of the business, you know your clients, you know what they might need. So I suppose it's a question of thinking to yourself, what might people need? And then maybe giving that to them. I think that's actually quite important.
I think it's making sure the order is correct. For example, we had a communication yesterday from a nursery. Again, no names here, but they were looking obviously to secure nursery fees for September, And in order to do that, they are offering some at-home application where they could basically, so parents could benefit from the nursery services at home. But they've actually, you can see they're trying to do here is generate or protect future revenue from the next term. But what they're forgetting is the reason why people use nursery in the first place. Yes. It's childcare. So you're not going to use that or pay for that service if you're going to have it at home, because you're not getting the childcare. You might be getting education, but education for a child who can barely walk is, do you see what I mean? They missed it. They've been thinking about money first and how can we make it second, rather than thinking how can we best serve our customers? Why do they use us? Are there any other ways we can serve them? If we can serve them, great. Then if we can't serve them, then perhaps how do we monetize it? So it's looking at it from two different angles, rather than thinking money first, value second. It's putting the value first. And then if people see the value, then of course they can monetize. But like I said, communicating, it becomes very cold when the communication is delivered the wrong way around, if that makes sense.
Yes, a little bit of empathy goes a very long way. Yeah. Putting yourself in the shoes of the particular stakeholders that you are addressing goes a very long way and is extremely, extremely helpful. Realizing that you may be needed to help at this point, not to sell. And that's okay too, because what we're talking about here is how do we come out of this with our reputation intact. Right. Thinking of things, now we will go into a little bit more detail about it shortly, but thinking about how you might get ahead of the news feed, how you might become a positive, proactive news story. That's a good idea. Offer something for free, offer some discounts, show that you're helping, show that you're part of a community. I have to be very careful what language that I'm using at the moment, because I saw an absolutely excoriating YouTube mashup yesterday. If you search for it, I'll try and put it up in a link after this, but it's basically why every COVID-19 ad is exactly the same. And you just blush with embarrassment for the poor people working in advertising agencies who had to rush out all of these commercials for all sorts of international, mostly American brands. But basically what they nailed was that every single ad starts with the same tinkly piano music, and then they all use exactly the same, you know, we're here for you, we're in this together, all this sort of thing. And it's very hard not to look at that video with the mashup of all the different companies' commercials saying exactly the same thing and not feel a bit cynical about the whole we're here for you scenario. But look, there is no, there's always room for empathy. There's always room for thinking about what your stakeholders might feel, put yourselves in their shoes. And I think if you do that effectively and say, what, if I was in their shoes, what would I like to be receiving? Then I think you're on the right track in general. It's tricky to navigate. If it wasn't tricky to navigate, there wouldn't be much need for people like me in this world, to be honest.
Okay, well look, before we get stuck into the first pillar, which is employees, does anybody have any questions or insights? Please just add them to the chat box. Remember, insight, just put capital I, then your insight. Obviously, question is fairly straightforward. Okay, so no questions so far, so it looks like we're on point. Right, let's kick off. So pillar one, or stakeholder one, you wanted to discuss.
Go on.
Employees.
Yeah, so we were going to, we had looked at, and I think Richard very kindly did some preliminary research to kind of look at the types of relationships that were being stressed. I can see Hans has a question. Does this crisis not show the limitations of social media? I think, I'm not entirely sure exactly what you mean, Hans. In a sense, I think it shows the limitations of social media with regard to being able to communicate effectively, because really there's been so many messages from CEOs, we'll say, on their phones and things like that. There's no substitute for nicely produced content that looks very professional. I'm not sure if that's what you mean. In terms of the limitations of social media, I think social media is very powerful in COVID times. I think it was powerful before now. We were talking about social media we're all limited to a few channels, but nothing new. I think if we had more channels than we have now, Hans, we'd all be actually driven crazy with LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, Reddit, YouTube's various. There's an awful lot of voices and there's an awful lot of noise. And I think that unfortunately, trust in your traditional media, we'll say print newspapers, reputable broadcasters, the BBC, CNN, etc. Trust in the mainstream media is being eroded because of a lot of, say, conspiracy theories on the internet and social media. Everybody has an opinion now, so that can make things very, very noisy. As I said before, Hans, I think what I would say is that in order to combat all of that and the problems that are set up by social media, when it gets noisy, you go simple. Decide what it is that you need to say and say it in as simple and clear a way as possible, because that way it will cut through the channels and the noise that you're having to listen to. Does that help answer the question?
I guess the key thing as well is choosing a channel that's appropriate for your audience as well, right?
Yeah.
So, for example, I don't use Facebook for my business because my business is executive search. My LinkedIn is the primary channel for me. So that's where I would do all my communication, should we say, but social communication at least. There's Gaurav has a question as well, I think.
Yeah, Gaurav, how would customers perceive new product launches from companies is a very, very good question.
Do you want to talk about that when we get to the clients and customers section?
Okay, we shall make a note of it.
Gaurav, we'll make a note of that question because we're going to cover employees first, then we'll come to clients and customers. So we'll come back to your question about how would customers perceive new product launches from companies. Okay.
Okay.
So let's get the employees out of the way. That doesn't sound right.
So we're going to look at how you might. I mean, this is internal crisis communications, but it's a really pertinent issue for a lot of leaders at the moment, a lot of managers, a lot of executives. How do you communicate the kind of bad news that a lot of people are having to communicate to staff? I mean, we're talking, worst case scenario, we're talking layoffs, but we're also talking all sorts of haircuts. I mean, even though companies don't want to do layoffs, there are situations where staff are being asked to go on unpaid leave, to take their holidays. I mean, that's the best case scenario, that you go on like your paid leave for a lot of people, that they're being asked to take significant cuts to either base salaries or various expenses that were being paid up until now. And yeah, these are the kind of bad news periods that managers have to deal with, and they're having to deal with so much of it at the moment. I think one of the most difficult things about this at the moment is that people don't know when it's going to end. That is the tricky bit. Before, we'll say my rationale would always have been, and the rationale that I've gotten from training and experience is usually, you can't go too wrong if you outline the rationale behind decisions. If you say, say for example, you're gathering your employees in a virtual room and you're saying, guys, listen, everybody has to take a 50% pay cut. We're so sorry about this. And if you outline, well, because of COVID-19, this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened, and as a result, our revenues have fallen. And in order to keep everybody safe, and in order to try and ensure that people have jobs at the end of it, this is what we're trying to do. In general, showing people the rationale behind your decision. Again, not too much granular detail, broad brushstrokes and bullet points, because people will only argue about details. And what I mean, they're well entitled to argue, but getting involved in pointless side discussions is not going to help you if you're trying to get a clear message across. So identify certain key steps that led up to a decision, communicate the key steps, and communicate the decision that has been made. If you are making a decision not to pay someone, that is a situation where your reputation will be impacted. You know, if you're making a decision where people are going to be worse off before you have a chat with them than, people are going to be worse off after you have this conversation with them, whether it's financially or in terms of benefits. These are the situations where reputation management is very important, because you can actually emerge from these sorts of situations with your reputation intact. You just need to be quite careful about it. So the first thing I would say is rationalize. The second thing is, it's okay to say we don't know. So when will things get back to normal? It's okay to say, at the moment, we don't know when things will get back to normal. We don't know when we will be able to put you back on full salary again. But then, as well as saying you don't know, you always marry that with a commitment to continue to monitor the situation and to report back.
Yeah, I think the uncertainty born out from an employee perspective would be, especially if someone's being a reduction in salary, for example, and some people I've spoken to have had as much as 40% in different countries. It's okay, if I accept this short term, then at what point do I go back to normal salary? What are the kind of metrics from a business perspective that are being measured that allow for that? I think the worry would be from an employee perspective is, I'm being taken for a ride. I'm being shortchanged. This will never return once I start delivering my normal work for a reduced amount. I think there's that trust element. So I guess what you're talking about with your communication is how can you maintain trust?
Well, the first thing you do, the first thing I said was you show the rationale behind a decision, so people can see the logic in what led us up to this point. Then they're understandably going to want timelines as to when they'll start getting paid 100% again, as an example. If you don't have that information, which a lot of employers don't have at the moment, because you don't know when the lockdown is going to end, you don't know when the vaccine is going to be found eventually, you don't know in the interim what's going to be happening. It's okay to say, we don't know, but it's only okay to say that if you undertake to report back regularly. So we don't know that right at this moment, but we will undertake to work very closely with the UAE authorities. Say, for example, you're running, I know nobody here is, but say, for example, you're running a restaurant or some sort of a business that's been shut down because of health and safety for COVID-19. We don't know at the moment when you'll be back serving waiting tables, but what we do know is that we are working very closely with the UAE authorities, and as soon as we have any more information from them, we will communicate it to you immediately. And then if you can, and if the situation goes on for quite a long time, it's usually a good idea to do a stakeholder briefing regularly enough, like once a week. Even if you come out and say, this is what we know at the moment, this is our situation at the moment, that keeps everybody reassured. That builds the trust. As long as you do it in a simple, controlled manner, as long as you don't go on too much in your updates, but as long as your stakeholders are seeing you, and this holds true for other types of stakeholders as well as employees, but it's quite important with employees that they're getting regular updates. And if you're their boss, I'm going to go back to this again, they need to see you on screen, or they need to see you in person, if that's possible. But I mean, obviously, safety concerns, it's not, but they need to see you, at least your face. A letter's not going to cut it, unfortunately.
As I mentioned to you the other day, one of the companies I spoke with last week, they had a really interesting take on how they were dealing with this challenge and the likely need to let people go, should we say. And what they were finding is that the people that were likely going to have to be let go, rather than be at home twiddling their thumbs or watching Netflix or losing value, should we say, in themselves, they were willing to continue to contribute to the business because they believed in the leadership of the business, even though they weren't in a position to pay them short term, such that they would continue developing the product suite so that the company could turn around a lot quicker. So that meant fast tracking certain developments. But I just thought it was really, really interesting. Interesting because the only reason these employees were willing to work essentially for free, short term, was because they believed in the leadership. They had that trust, and they believed that the leadership had their back. I just thought it was quite inspirational the way this gentleman had set his organization up and really empowered his employees to still be employees. Because I think a lot of people, we define ourselves by what we do for a living, right? And in recognizing that in itself is quite powerful, because he understood that his employees would rather work for free and still be still hold a title, let's say, rather than be not working for anyone. That would be in a worse, the same situation is true. So both situations, they're not earning, but one situation, they're still developing themselves. It's not that the company is taking advantage of them, it's that there's this mutual recognition that when we're back on track, we can only get back on track with your support, and when we're back on track, you will benefit. But that trust was clearly there.
The key word that you use there, Richard, and that's a brilliant example, is empowerment. I would use the word agency or personal responsibility. I think in huge situations of crisis like we find ourselves in at the moment, there can be a sense as individuals of helplessness, of lack of control. And what really helps in terms of as individuals settling us down, and certainly as employees helping us to settle down and feel more in control of our own personal situations, is a sense of personal responsibility, is a sense of empowerment. And the best leaders who communicate this well have used this very wisely throughout the COVID-19 crisis. As you can hear from my accent, I'm Irish. I'm going to use a good example from the Irish Minister for Health, who's a guy called Simon Harris. And if you look up any of Simon Harris's addresses to people, whether it's on talk shows or on the news programs, his message is always quite personal and emphasizes personal responsibility. So what it says is, you know, first of all, there's empathy. You know, we know this is really difficult, but then there's a very positive, proactive message that emphasizes the agency, i.e. the empowerment, the power that each individual has in order to make a difference to the community as a whole. So what he says is, we know this is very difficult, but think of the difference you're making. Think of the difference you're making to your grandmother. Think of the difference you're making to your neighbor, to your community. And I mean, that's, we'll say, on a national health level, but we see the same thing in your example, that, you know, employees who feel that they have control over their destiny, that they are choosing to do this work, to bring the company forward, to get whatever new product they have across the line, that is giving them a sense of personal purpose and responsibility that is actually benefiting them probably on a personal level as well as on a professional level. So that's, so I suppose if we think about the key takeaways when we're dealing with employees as a leader, say number one, I would say, is offer the rationale behind your decisions. Number two is be empathetic. So put yourself in the shoes of the person that you're speaking to. And the third one is offer a sense of agency, offer a sense of personal responsibility. Ask people how they can help themselves. That is really helpful when you're dealing with employees.
Wonderful. Okay, look, before we move on to the second part, which would be the clients and customers, does anybody have any questions or insights that specifically relate to the employee section of this discussion?
Gara's asking, how do we handle new joiners who are on visa change stage to join a company in the current situation? Company might not want them. I think, in a sense, I'm going to pass that ball to your HR expert, Gareth, because that would be, unless you're talking about a large group of new joiners, that's not necessarily a communications issue. That's more of a HR issue, in my view, unless Richard has another opinion.
No, so just so just to clarify, in case someone didn't hear the question. So the question was, how do we handle new joiners who are on a visa change stage to join a new company in current situation? Company might not want them now. So I have a situation in the UK, or I have a situation, a close friend of mine in the UK who has fallen foul of this exact situation. So she left one job to start another. Obviously offer letter signed and what have you, everything was progressing. Literally the day before she started work, she was let go essentially of her new job. So she's left in limbo with no job. She can't go back to her previous employer, and her new employer no longer wants her. That, you know, how, the question is, how do we handle those new joiners? Again, is really down to, I guess, your company's HR policy, because it seems quite, again, from a personal perspective, knowing someone who this has happened to, it seems very unfair that a new starter would be laid off before they've actually started, given the fact that they've quit their previous job on the basis of this offer. So it's morally, I think we should still take them, bring them into our fold if we've made that commitment to them. But again, I think that's really, as Eva suggested, that would be a case for the HR division within your organisation. I'm not sure what the legal stance would be regarding that. You know, what kind of right the employee would have. As you quite rightly articulated, in this country, they'd be on a visa change stage. So I don't know. I'm not going to articulate any more than that because I honestly don't know. But good question, Gaurav. Thank you. Okay, so let's move on to the clients and customer section then, please, Eve.
Moving on to your second group of stakeholders that we thought were relevant to this webinar, and that is your clients, your customers. The first thing I'd say with them is what I've already said. Remember the amount of noise that they're dealing with and try and keep your messaging as simple as possible. The next thing I'm going to talk about is about what you might do for them. So Gaurav, I'm going to get to your question about how they would perceive new product launches in a second, but let's talk about what you already offer. And let's talk about some examples, without mentioning any names, of what we might have observed in the market and even in our personal lives of what companies have been offering over the last month. Now, people have been badly hit by this crisis. Households have been hit, earnings have been hit, people are struggling financially. There's an awful lot of difficulty. And let's go back to what I said at the beginning about you can tarnish or polish here. If you can afford it at all, this is a good opportunity to give your customers something, whether that's a discount, whether that's, you know, a couple of, if you're a training company, a couple of free training sessions, whatever you can think of that might give them something in a time when things are difficult. That's the sort of thing that you can do that will polish your reputation and keep your reputation nice and bright and shiny well into the post-COVID-19 world. And we can see companies who have done just that. For example, and I'll mention them because it's a very positive thing to mention, my family and I are members of a group called Privily, which is where you pay a monthly subscription and you get to use the facilities at various hotels and resorts around the UAE. Now, obviously, with all facilities being shut down for the lockdown, these facilities were not available to Privily members. It was really, really early in the lockdown, like before things had gone even towards curfew, that unsolicited, I got an email from Privily one day which said, due to matters outside our control, we can see that you're not able to use any of the nice facilities that you're paying a subscription for every month. So just to let you know, we're pausing your subscription. We'll let you know when things are back open again, but just so you know, you're not wasting money at the moment. And I thought to myself, brilliant, look at that. Not solicited in any way. Nobody was looking for it. Well, at least I wasn't. I hadn't heard any major calls for it. But this company had unilaterally decided to pause a subscription. You've heard of quite a lot of the gyms doing it. There's a very nice gym that I'm a member of just across the road in Business Bay called GFX. They had to shut down all of their operations, but they gave everybody an online gym subscription with access to different classes that nobody had to pay for. These kind of things, they actually give you a little, as a consumer, they give you a little bit of a warm, fuzzy feeling. And you think to yourself, you know what, when this is over, I will go back. And customers do, they do remember things like that. I'll always remember, for example, that these guys gave me some free online classes. And if you saw me jumping up and down trying to do body pump in my living room, you might disagree, but it was, I really appreciated it, certainly.
I think the point you're making is just value, right? We need to be consistently delivering value for our clients and customers.
Yes.
And that, like you say, that's measured in different ways. Like you say, the proactive communication, the recognition that people can't use perhaps our current offering. You know, it kind of ties in nicely, Gaurav, to your question about how would customers perceive new product launches from companies. Well, the question I guess you really have to ask yourself is, why are we launching a product? Are we launching it because it solves a problem that's now relevant to our customers? Then if that is truly relevant to our customers, given the current situation, then they'll welcome it with open arms. If they see it as opportunistic in any way, or not relevant because the business model has changed, then that will of course be negatively perceived. You know, and I'm talking now as someone who's worked in sales all my life and had to sell various different products, services in many different markets and market conditions. And there is always a way to sell a product or service. It just means your customer may be different though. You know, the customer you served a few months ago may no longer be your customer, because the product, your old product offering is no longer relevant to that customer, which is why a new product offering may keep them as a customer because you have now something relevant, or a new product that you've developed based on the changing market conditions may open up a completely new revenue stream for you. So I think the question of how would customers perceive a new product, look at it from their perspective. Is it relevant to them? If it is, there's no problem. If it's not, of course there will be rejection.
Yeah, I mean, and obviously you know far more about sales than I do, Richard, in the sense that, and that makes a huge amount of sense, even from the point of view of what I was talking earlier about empathy. A little bit of empathy goes a long way. Put yourself in your customer's shoes. Are they going to need this? Is this going to be helpful at this time? Or is this just going to be yet another piece of noise that's going to add to the daily barrage of noise that is going on in their inboxes? And if you're not going to be contributing something that's helpful, a new product that's helpful is very, very welcome. Otherwise, I would say no. I'm just going to go back to, we'll say, the offering of discounts and freebies, and just draw your attention to a couple of the pitfalls that can happen there. If you're going to offer a discount, I would say, and this is not from a sales perspective, because of course, Richard, I understand that you know more than I ever will about sales, but this is in terms of reputation management. If you're going to offer a discount, how did I think of this example? Let's talk about, for example, education providers and fees for distance learning. Just as one that randomly came to my head, I don't know why. So if you're in education, so background for anyone who's been living on a rock for the last month, education providers have moved a lot of their training and education to distance learning. Now, distance learning isn't quite as effective as classroom learning, and also demands a lot of buy-in from parents and people to help learners. Now, we're definitely not going to mention any names here, but what I can say is, using this as an example, the education providers who came out of the blocks quickly, offering a discount with no strings attached, announcing it before there was any pressure to do so, will come through this COVID-19 crisis with their reputations enhanced and embellished. The second group of education providers who probably waited a little bit too long to see what the competitors were doing, but then offered their discounts, they'll come out of it with their reputation more or less intact. But you don't want to be the education provider or whatever your business is. You don't want to be the provider that is the very, very last to offer a discount that all of your competitors are offering. Because obviously, if you do offer any kind of discount at the very end, then it's not going to be seen as something that you wanted to do. It's going to be seen as something that you had to do. So in a sense, from a reputation perspective, if you're going to give benefits or discounts, get in early, publicize it all you like, but don't be seen to be shamed into giving a discount, because that's not going to work for your reputation. Yeah,
right. At least I think, I've never, in all honesty, been a fan of discounts from a sales perspective, but I'm certainly a fan of offering value, let's say, just, I guess, packaging a different discount differently. Value upfront, certainly ahead of the competition, because it just solidifies the relationship you have with your with your clients. And if you're mindful of the fact that sometimes, you know, we're offering a service to someone who's buying the same service from a number of different vendors, in a situation like today, they're going to be faced a choice of, okay, we can't afford to pay each one of our vendors or service providers. Who do we cut first? Now, maybe that you don't necessarily have the best product, but the reality is you've got the best relationship because of what you've already proactively pursued with your clients. And that's the thing that will be remembered. So I think that's the kind of key takeaway, if you like. Is that right for you, Eve?
Yeah, and I think if we're to sum up how the three key takeaways for dealing with your clients and customers is, I would say, but taking on board what you said, if you don't like the concept of discounts, but offer what you're going to offer them upfront and unprompted, without being seen to be pressurized into it because all of your competitors are doing it. Keep your messaging simple. And I would say use positive and proactive language where you can without being inappropriate, in terms of seeing what you can do for your customers. And to go back to Gaurav's question, if you're launching a new product, that's a positive thing to do. As long as it's helpful, use that positive and proactive language.
Excellent. Okay, so that wraps up the second. So before we move on to the last one, any questions or insights again, guys, please put them in the chat box. I think the content is on point, Eve. No further questions. So let's move on to the final section. This is actually quite interesting for me. So this is clients or rather the non-paying clients, non-paying investors. So just to kind of frame what I'm talking about here, guys. So because again, these challenges have been articulated to me by customers I spoke to over the last few weeks. So they're in a situation whereby some of their clients that they delivered work for already have not paid or are certainly delaying payment. And there are also some situations where there are investors in an organization that are freezing investments given the crisis because they, as a board level, let's say, aren't sold on the current strategy or the direction of the business. So either way, there's a dry up of fund from both the input stage above the company and also from a ground level from a revenue generation perspective. And they can obviously affect the business, and they can obviously affect it from an emotional point of view. They can have quite a damaging effect on an organization if the person who's emotionally charged with this information makes knee-jerk decisions, reactions, or communications. So, Eve, what would you like to add regarding this section?
This one's quite simple because communication really needs to be kept as private as possible. Please be very, very careful not to have these conversations in any sort of public domain. Keep the channels as closed as you can. Keep the conversations between as few people as need to speak. What I would say is whether you're dealing with investors holding onto purse strings or people who owe you money, holding onto that money, these are very tricky times to negotiate that. You also have to remember that the defamation law in the UAE also applies to naming and shaming people who owe you money. Please be aware of that. You can fall foul of the law in that respect. So in a sense, these conversations by their very nature and legally have to be kept absolutely private. And I think a lot of people will understand that, but just in case that message needs to be got across, keep your messages, keep your channels private. Need to know, and anybody who needs to be in those conversations but nobody else. Keep your messages simple. Again, if you need to have any sort of a difficult conversation, as we've been saying from the very beginning of this webinar, the best thing to do is to sit down beforehand and work out what your goals are, what your messaging needs to achieve, and then look at that messaging and try and make it as simple as possible. Drill it down into as short sentences as you can have, the most simple sentences that you can have. To be honest, I mean, I know this is the business that I do. I do run a boutique communications company. It is our job to get that messaging as simple as possible. If you can't do it for yourself, get specialized company to do it for you, whether it's in negotiations with your investors or whether it's in all sorts of other areas. Get some messaging advice so that your messaging is as clear as possible. And the final thing that I'd say when you're dealing with people who owe you money is try to keep a cool head. You know, losing it, panicking, losing tempers doesn't work so much. I see Rami's got to go. I think a lot of people may have to go soon, but it was lovely to have you here, Rami. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Rami. So look, I think we'll wrap with it, but I think it's quite a really interesting one to talk on. There's probably a little bit more actually to talk on in this particular one, because I think I think the frustrating thing from a business perspective, if you've got a client who you've looked after, you've served for years, and now they can't pay for whatever reason, as much as there's the relationship, that loyalty there, the reality is I guess we need to appreciate that they're not paying us for a reason, right? There's perhaps this protectionist mentality whereby if they pay us, they go out of business, so they want to look after their own business. I think at a personal level, we need to have that empathy, like you already mentioned when we were talking to clients, and customers and employees, in fact. So we're just understanding of our customers' position, and if there's anything we can do to maintain that relationship, even if at a business level there's a short-term, should we say, breakdown, but we don't. Again, we want to maintain as many relationships as we possibly can with regard to the business. But if there's any way of preserving the relationship or really understanding why our customers are making those tough choices, and I think this kind of feeds into a session that I'll be hosting in a few weeks' time, which focuses more on revenue protection and revenue generation from a sales perspective during a crisis. And one of the kind of pillars of that is getting closer to our customers, irrespective of whether they are paying customers or potentially defaulting customers. We need to be closer to our customers now than ever we have been. So we'll be exploring strategies on how we would do that in a session I'll be hosting in a few weeks' time. So look, just to kind of sum up, the three, if there are any insights or questions, please obviously add them to the chat box, guys. But just to kind of round up the session, so the three things that three stakeholders we've been walking through today are: one, employees. So the three takeaways there are: when you communicate, you need to communicate the rationale behind decisions, you need to do it in an empathetic way, and you need to do it giving people a degree of agency. So give people a sense of purpose in your communication will mean that they buy into what you're saying, and you're able to maintain that degree of trust and relationship that will serve both you and your employee long term. From a client or customer's perspective, again, take the opportunity to make your communication upfront and unprompted would be the best advice. Keep the messaging simple, and where obviously possible, be positive and productive language, right? So keep it positive and upbeat. And then finally, to kind of round off the session, we talk about the non-paying clients or investors. The key takeaway here is really just to keep these channels private. As much as we become emotionally charged when people don't pay us for the services we've delivered or pay us to continue the business in the way that we've successfully done over the last few years, let's say, this information shouldn't necessarily be shared with other stakeholders like employees, like other clients, because that, irrespective of laws, it's just morally not the right thing to do, and it will look bad on you. Even if you're not necessarily the one in the wrong, the way you communicate will be perceived as wrong. So look, without further ado, that's it for me. And Eve, I just want to say, Eve, thank you very much for your time today. I think it's been a very valuable session.
Thank you very much for inviting me, Richard. That was fantastic. If anybody listening needs any help with messaging or media training, you can, or even if you've got some questions to follow up on the session today, you can email me, eve@hwm.ae. That's Eve, E-V-E, @hwm.ae. Or you can connect up with me on LinkedIn, and I'll make it my business to either answer any of your questions or help out with any messaging or training dilemmas.
Wonderful, thank you very much. Just one final thing. So over the coming weeks, with the next few sessions we'll be compiling, Alchematics as a company will be compiling all the insights we've gained from industry experts. We'll be compiling these in a white paper, over the next couple of months and giving them to companies. So if you're interested in receiving a copy of this white paper, just put a comment in the chat box and I can make sure you receive it once it's ready. So that's it. Thank you very much, everybody. Have a wonderful day, and I will see you again next week.
Bye, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.